Everybody thinks he's doing disclosure, but Tom DeLonge isn't doing disclosure. He's doing the money deal. So he's got a media corporation called To the Stars, and he wants it like a Star Wars thing. He wants the toys. He wants the multiple series, multiple books, and he's going to control all these UFO stories and make piles of money out of this, and at the same time get the story out. So fine if he wants to do that. I wanted to tell people, this is nothing new, folks. They're just running the same deal that they ran before. So what I did is set up the book. I called the book Managing Magic, the Government's UFO Disclosure Plan. And I've been involved since the 80s through a number of these programs where I knew the people that were in it, and they just run the same thing. So, and Jacques Vallée first started this back in, I think, the 1970s or 80s. He said, I'd be very surprised if this turned out to be just ET. And I used to think it was nuts. I thought, well, what are you talking about, And now I sort of understand what he's talking about, because you get a lot of orbs. The number one mentioned being is not an alien. It's not a gray. It's not a human type alien. It's a ball of light or an etheric type being. This is the number one reported thing. So it has this element that not all ETs are flesh and blood. So I had sort of made this shift on the ET front. So the way I set it up is I said it was called Managing Magic, and this is the way I think they look at it. For example, in the CIA, if you look at some of the people who have talked about it, the word they use is phenomenology. And when you see they released, just at the end of the Obama administration, they released all these documents, these UFO documents, but they came along with the remote viewing documents. They were all together. And that's the thing. It's not just, it's this across the spectrum that people are parsing it. So they're saying there's remote viewing, then there's experiencers, and then the experiencers say to me, we're not channelers. Don't call us channelers. Channelers are faking it. And then there's remote viewing people, and then there's psychic people, and then you have all these different components. And what I came to sort of believe myself, right or wrong, it's all the same thing, is that in January of 2016, something happened. At that point, they suddenly decided they have to get this out. Now, I don't know what's happened, whether there's some sort of event they know is coming, whatever it is, but suddenly they are in like hyper mode to get this story out. What I've been told, and I'm getting it from multiple sources, is that there's multiple teams. I always thought it was just like a government disclosure, like there's one guy, there's one program. I'm told there are 6 teams. The one source says 6 teams that are doing this. I heard $1 billion was going to get dropped into this thing, that one of the richest people in the world, and I could have got the name if I wanted, but I always wanted to stay on the outside. I didn't want to force my sources to give me stuff. I just would say, I told them, I'm listening, everything's on the record, I would just listen, and when people would talk, I would listen to what they're saying, but I didn't really go and say, I was told about the fact that there was this guy who's one of the richest people in the world is backing this operation. And I could have forced the name out, and I figured, no, I don't want to force it out, because that's their thing. But $200 million has already been collected, and what he's going to come out with, because everybody's waiting for the big announcement, and the big announcement is going to be to deal with this media thing with the toys and all this sort of stuff, and it's going to be Spielberg, J.J. Abrams as director, and they're going to run I heard 100 episodes. Looks like a series is going to run for 5 years, from what I heard. The government wants to get this stuff out, but you can't. You have there's 3 options. The government, if they wanted to disclose, would go to the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and Fox News. And they would just say, here, we're taking you on a tour, show them the bodies, show them the craft, move them to the next room, the president's standing there, whatever questions you want to ask, whatever you need to ask, we're gonna disclose. But they're not doing that. It's very evident they're not doing that. The other thing is, people say, well, they're covering up. And I say, well, no, they're not covering up. Because if they want to cover up, they'll do exactly what the Canadians did in 1967. The Canadians released all the UFO files, and then they just shut up. There's 10% experiencers in high-level government. And this was confirmed. Jim Semivan is one of them. Jim Semivan was a presidential briefer until 2007 when he retired. And he had an experience in the 1990s. And he woke up, and his wife was bleeding. They were in the room, and the beings were in the room. And his description, he wrote a foreword to one of Tom DeLonge's books. He said, it shattered my idea of reality. And he said, the idea that you can measure this thing, and this comes down to this material, was this a nuts and bolts thing? He said, and this is a guy who's presidential briefer, who would have gotten some sort of briefing as to what's going on, said, How do you, the idea that you can measure this thing is laughable. How do you measure something where there doesn't appear to be any there? This has got to do with phenomena or multidimensional stuff that our science has no idea what to do. So he's involved. So I have him as one of the people, and he's running some of these operations that where I believe they're disclosing stuff. And then you have Jim Wosley, who was with Stephen Greer. Stephen Greer did the briefing, and he apparently went with Ron Pandolfi in December to brief Donald Trump, along with a guy by the name of Mike Pillsbury. And these three guys did the briefing, talked to Donald Trump about what was going on.
What are you going to do about UFO files? 22 countries have disclosed their UFO files. What are you going to do about that? Has anything crossed your desk? UFO files. UFO files. When are we going to disclose? Are we ever going to disclose? We need to know the truth. We need to know the truth. We need to know the truth.
So they're using these sort of tricks. So they're not covering up, and they're not disclosing, which means they're doing something in between, which is what I got dragged into with Bob Emenegger, Bill Moore, Stephen Greer, all this sort of stuff, where they're leaking the story, but they're protecting the classified material. So I have the 14 magicians, and most of them are contract CIA guys who they bring back out of retirement, and that's the way they work it. So you're not going to use a white world guy who's on the books at the CIA. You're going to have a guy who's in the black world, in that contract world, because it's all plausible deniability. Exactly right. It's all plausible deniability. So you got the 14 magicians, and then I got the key is the 5 messiahs, and so I've got Stephen Greer, I've got Tom DeLonge, I've got Dan Smith. And most of them, I say, you have to have multiple sources. Like Stephen Greer claims 540, Tom DeLonge claims 10, Bill Moore had 24. Bill Moore was one of the messiahs. And then I have a guy by the name of Dan Smith. And Dan Smith is the best friend of Ron Pandolfi. Now, that's his only source, but I give him the credit because he's got the key guy. I mean, he's had 26 years of conversations with him. And the way it works is Dan says, I know him, he's the godfather to his child, he's his best man at his second wedding, and he'll be talking, and Ron will say something about what's going on. For example, he'll say, I was looking around at who gets briefed on this thing, and I realized that the group that seems to be the key is Office of Naval Intelligence, that everybody above a flag officer at the Office of Naval Intelligence gets a briefing. And he'll only say it one time. So they compromise people. They say, I've got something. I'm from whatever intelligence agency, and I've got this, but you can't identify me. Mm-hmm. And it's the same game. So they give you this stuff. It's plausible deniability. You're never allowed to answer your source. So I have these 5 messiahs, and these are guys. And the other thing about them is they all absolutely believe they're messiahs. They absolutely believe that they have been called to release this story to the world, that they got picked. So when you talk to Tom DeLonge and say, oh, you're being used. No, I'm not being used. No. These guys are my friends. Bill Moore will say the same thing. And yet you have opposite views. For example, Bill Moore will say, not Bill Moore, but Stephen Greer will say, all aliens are good. Mm-hmm. And the government is evil. The government is withholding this thing. And Tom DeLonge says exactly the opposite. He said the government is the good guys, and they're saving us from these evil aliens, and I support the good guys. And then you get Dan Smith, who's his view, and his plausible deniability is he's an eschatologist. So he's into the end of the world. He's got all this religious stuff. He blogs, and most of his stuff is religious stuff. And when you read him, you go like, oh, I can't read this garbage. Just like, oh, he makes my head spin. And because he's into this eschatology thing. But when I talked to him, I said, well, did Ron talk to you about this kind of stuff? He said, no, we've never talked about religion. We've never talked about that kind of stuff. Never. And I said, well, you talked to his wife, because Ron Pandolfi's wife is actually involved as well. And he said, well, yeah, we had one conversation on camera where we were talking like she's Muslim and he's Christian. But he said it was a very surface conversation about religion. So his thing is that the government doesn't talk about that kind of stuff. So that's my impression, that the government will never talk about who the others, as they're described to Tom DeLonge, who the others are, or whether they're good or whether they're evil or what their intentions. That's never part. So that may be part of the classified stuff. They just give you all this other stuff as to how it operates, where the crafts are, or how this thing is being funded, or stuff like that. But that part is never discussed. So the Messiah brings his message into it and believes that the government is carrying his message, and they're not. So they're being, I wouldn't say they're being used. People said they're being used. I say they're being managed. They're being managed to put out a story. The significant part that got me dragged back into this thing, because I didn't want to be a part of this thing again. I got dragged back in because of the Hillary Clinton thing. I had written the Hillary Clinton book, and I had done the presidents. And when Hillary got involved, and then suddenly Tom DeLonge was named with John Podesta, her campaign manager, I got dragged back in because I realized, like, I've seen this. People have to know that this has happened. Like in the book, I list year by year, and almost every year I can pick up a story where it said, this is a government leak. For example, Walt Disney, 1956. Exactly the same story as Bob Emenegger. He's asked to do a documentary, and he'd done a lot of documentaries for the U.S. government during World War II. So Disney does this documentary. He's going to get all the film and the stuff at the end. They pull the film. Same story. So he puts out the documentary, and you have the Serpo story. You have all these sort of stories that are dragged into the UFO community, and they're gradually leaking it. So you have these multiple things that are being managed and put out there, and most of it's going through Hollywood. Like the Bledsoe thing is also going to be going through Hollywood. And then the big thing came down where they got these 6 teams going. There's multiple operations. I'm being told this is for real. The Tom DeLonge thing's for real, and I was told it's not going to be full disclosure, but it's going to be big. You can't believe. I would hear these words. You can't believe it. This is going to be big. This is massive.